WKCR-FM New York 89.9 on your dial, the original FM. We're going to talk with Arnaldo DeSouteiro, a producer, a newspaper man who works with everybody, especially the people at CTI Records and so many re-releases. But we're going to talk about something never approached, especially this side of the ocean. Some recordings of Tom Jobim, about 2 albums. Arnaldo DeSouteiro, who did the re-release and work with Miucha and Tom Jobim of the 2 albums, the Jobim and Miucha work in Brazil. So we're going to ask him from the beginning, that I was talking to Arnaldo, about the shows that Tom, Toquinho, Vinicius, and Miucha did at the Canecão, this big house, show house that we had in Rio in the 1970s. Arnaldo, welcome to the Tom Jobim birthday broadcast.
Oh, Jassvan, once again, thank you for having me one more time. And it was a pleasure past years to talk about Stoneflower and the Adventurers soundtrack that I love and all those albums from the 70s. But when you mentioned that Canecão, it's incredible because I remember that I went there for the first time when I was 11 years old. I was invited by a famous arranger called Gaia, Maestro Gaia. I can't explain now, but I was already friends with him when I was 11 years old, and he was conducting there. A concert by Chico Buarque and Maria Bethânia. He did the arrangements and conducted the orchestra, and he invited me. So I went there many times. All the weekends I was there, and it was a big impact for me because I had already seen many symphony orchestras performing, but classical music, since I was 4 or 5 years old. But playing modern Brazilian music, pop Brazilian music, what we call MPB, it was the first time, so to have an orchestra with a rhythm section and percussion and piano, bass, drums, everybody playing together. It was something fascinating for me to listen. And I remember that the song that was almost, we can say, the main song of that concert that stayed. It was like a 3-4 month engagement at Canecão. Was a song called "Vai Levando." Was the first song that Chico Buarque and Caetano Veloso wrote together, and they wrote it especially for that show by Chico and Bethânia. It's a connection because that's the first song that Miucha and Jobim recorded together in '77 for one of these albums, And then this first album that they did in '77 was so successful, and this song in particular, and especially Vai Levando, became the opening song of a very famous, popular soap opera in Brazil. And soap operas, they have a big audience, so it helped a lot the album to become popular in Brazil and to play on radio and everybody, because they played this recording by Jobim and Miucha. So that was the connection. And then they did the 7-month engagement at Canecão. Do you imagine? You play? It's like a Broadway show that you spend 7 months performing every week. The same concert. And I just spoke this afternoon with Ana Jobim, that is Antônio Carlos Jobim, wife and widow, his last wife. And I told her, "Oh, I'm going once again to do the show with Jassvan, the Jobim birthday broadcast, and I was wanting to check some informations and check also informations about this engagement at Canecão." And then I asked her, "Are you on the album? Do you sing on the album?" And she said, "No, unfortunately, no, fortunately not, because when I joined the band, she was part of the female backing vocal group that concert. It was almost in the last months of the show. So the album had been already recorded and already released.
I read on the book by his sister, the Illuminated Man,
Helena.
Elena, I'm sorry,
Yeah, yeah,
Elena Jobim. Yes.
exactly.
Anyway,
Yes.
Elena Jobim. And I remember when they come to New York to release the book, she was there was a special celebration at Carnegie Hall for Jobim after his
Mm-hmm.
passed away. Was produced by
Mm-hmm.
Ettore and Pat Phillips.
For the
And they,
Strata.
yeah, Ettore Strata. And I read the book, and she writes in the book, a chapter about how was 7 months with Jobim and Vinicius together, because they were, it's not saying the least little heavy drinkers, and
Yeah.
she's talking about the Jobim staying out partying the whole night, as they is in the book. I don't know. You heard about this?
Yeah, there are many different stories. One of them that is also mentioned on another book that is by Sérgio Cabral, and both books have many good things and both have many mistakes, and things that are not exactly what like there. And at the time of the Canecão engagement, uh, it was Jobim had already divorced from the first wife, and from Teresa, and he was like in a drink diet, like say that, that he and Vinicius decided to stop drinking at least during the Canecão part, and there's a famous story that, and they use it to put tea instead of of whiskey, instead of scotch on the bottles, But the people that was looking thought that they were drinking all the time, but they were drinking tea. And then that seems that one day, the first day that they did this joke, Miucha came and took that, and Vinicius screamed, "Be careful! Be careful! This is not scotch. This is tea. It's very
Uh,
dangerous to your health." Uh,
okay, another thing. When they release the first one, there is 1977, right?
yes, yes.
The first album,
7 7. Yes.
Miucha, and the first
Antonio
one,
Carlos Jobim. Yes.
right? Antonio Carlos Jobim.
Yeah,
Okay,
and it was supposed to be just Miucha album. She had been signed to RCA, and then she invited Jobim because, of course, they were already friends for many many years. Because people don't know, if people that don't know about Miucha so much outside Brazil, she's the sister of Chico Buarque de Holanda, that always was a very close friend of Jobim, and they did together the famous song Sabiá, who won the festival, the contest in Rio, and then Jobim later recorded this song on Stoneflower and other albums. So Miúcha was already very close, and she was married at that time. Well, she had been married, and it was a very also complicated relationship with João Gilberto. But João Gilberto loved her so much, and they loved each other really until both died. They were very close and very connected. And she used it to say to me and João also, "Oh, now we are, after we divorced, we became much better friends. They started to feel much better, and all the problems disappeared. And she used it to go to his house almost every day and on a daily basis. It was incredible. They really loved each other, even not being in a love relationship anymore. But let's go back just for 75. Miúcha is in the United States with João Gilberto, living in New Jersey, and they were invited to record an album. João Gilberto was invited to record an album with Stan Getz once again. They had already recorded two albums in the 60s, the famous Get Gilberto, and then the follow-up that was Get Gilberto Volume 2, that was a live date at Carnegie Hall in 64. After the first one was recorded in studio in 63, the second one in Carnegie Hall, at Carnegie Hall in 64. And then in 75, Stan Getz decided to do another album with João Gilberto. And this time, instead of Astrud Gilberto, the singer was Miucha. You know? She appears on the album cover, and strangely, oddly, she never received a big credit on the cover, neither on the back cover, only in the insert. You know, the original album was not a gatefold album, but it had an insert, and then her name was there in very small letters, Heloísa Buarque de Holanda. You know, so for people that has this second album of Stan Getz, that is the name of the album is The Best of Two Worlds, you know? O melhor dos dois mundos. And Stan Getz featuring João Gilberto, produced by Getz and Tio Macero. That one is one of my idols because he worked with Miles Davis. He did my favorite Miles Davis albums. They are all produced by Tio Macero from the 60s till Beaches Brew and everything in the 70s. Almost everything was done by Tio Macero. Also interesting that I think that around 2004, 2005, I was invited by Sony, the director, the A&R of jazz at Sony Music in the United States. I used to work a lot for them at that time. And Mr. Seth Rothstein, that became a dear friend of mine, he invited me to do this reissue of this album because João Gilberto had been telling me for years that he wanted very much to have this album remixed because, as always, he complained about Stan Getz playing. He never complained about Stan Getz playing, but about the way the saxophone was mixed, that he always thought that it was very high on the mix, you know, very loud. And then he told me he knew that I was doing a lot of things for Sony, and he said, "Oh, please try to reissue the album. You know, I can work with you on this." I said, "Okay." When I told Seth Rothstein, João Gilberto is interested in re-releasing the album, he said, "Of course, we can do it immediately." And then we started the project. We did the remixes. I found many unreleased tracks, many. Each track of this album has 4 or 5 takes, the minimum, you know. And I have these tapes. I have these copies on CD copies that he made. I was producing the project with Bob Belden. Bob Belden was also working for Sony at that time. Bob was a famous arranger, producer, and he recorded several albums as a leader. His pianist was a friend of mine too, that was Mark Copeland. And by the way, I was introduced to Mark Copeland by Duduca da Fonseca in New York. We did the project, and then Bob Belden suddenly died in a very young age of a heart attack. And Seth Rothstein was left the Sony, you know. So the project simply disappeared from my hands because for the several following months, I had nobody to talk with Portman anymore. It was like it disappeared, you know, the project disappeared. And I still have everything ready, the liner notes and many things that I will try one day to send you the copies of because they are wonderful. Well, so João Gilberto released this album with Miucha, and Jobim was invited to play on the album. But the money he asked was too much for Stan, and Stan didn't want to spend half of the budget that he had from Sony at the time in 75 with Jobim. So what happened was that Jobim didn't record on the album, but he gave some songs to be recorded there, and among them, for the first time, there was a recording of Double Rainbow that was Chovendo na Roseira, that had been written for the Adventurers soundtrack. We use it to be called children's games because it is a big, beautiful scene on the movie that some children, the two kids, play on the garden, on the yard. So it was children games. And then later on, Elis Regina recorded in Portuguese for the first time with Portuguese lyrics. And then for this Stan Getz album, Gene Lees added the English lyrics, and it became known as Double Rainbow. That's the story. The song has three names, Children Games, Chovendo na Roseira, and Double Rainbow.
And about the releases outside Brazil of those albums, because I have a copy that I got for Antonio Carlos Jobim and Miucha. They changed, they put his name in front of Miucha. And this one that I have, a copy, was released in France. And they have another one released on the US by BMG RCA. The one that you did it in Brazil, but they did the compilation of both of them, and I was released here as Echoes of Rio, Antonio Carlos Jobim. They don't use the name of Miucha, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, I know. It was like when now famous Elis Regina album, it was Jobim, that when it was released in 73, and 74 in some countries, they never released it in the United States because Elis Regina was not famous outside Brazil. So this album only became available in the USA for the first time 93, 94, something like that, during the CD era. And then they changed it. Instead of Elise Tom, it is Antonio Carlos Jobim, his full name, and Elis Regina. Because if they had released it on CD as Elise Tom, everybody would have asked, who is Elis Regina? And then the same thing happened with Miucha. So in 76, actually, it was exactly in October 75, Jobim and Miucha recorded together for the first time on the Urubu album. They recorded the song that you played already sometimes on your show, great show, that is Oboto. That is a famous track with Ray Barreto. Ray Barreto, no, is another. Ray Armando. Ray Armando was the percussion player that was recording everything with Klaus Ogerman at that time. It's Ron Carter, João Palma, and Ray Armando on percussion. And they did this song called Oboto. It was in October 75.
I'm
Then
sorry,
Miucha
I want to ask you, what about the beating ball? Who played the open of the beating ball on Ubuntu?
I confirmed it with João Palma. He was a close friend of mine who was the drummer. It was Ray Armando. It was Armando. Ayrton was very much in demand, and it was in the heyday of his career, So he was not doing so many sideman recordings at the time because he recorded a lot with Jobim. But it's really Ray Armando, and João Palma used it to tell me, you see, I should have played this because this guy didn't have swing to play berimbau. This is berimbau without swing. I don't know how Jobim allowed it to be on the album. Palma was very furious about this. But anyway, and after this, João Gilberto recorded, Jobim, Miucha did a single, a four-track single, an EP, but on 7-inch EP in Brazil for Philips. And Jobim gave her a song called Correnteza that he wrote with Luiz Bonfá. It was not the first recording of the song because a singer called Luiz Cláudio had already recorded it. And one of just concerning the first album that was in 77, one of the many mistakes on the Sérgio Cabral book is that he mentions that when they came to record the album in 77, the first song that Jobim recorded with Miucha was Correnteza. And I released this track in a compilation that I did for Verve Records that was The Trip to Brazil. And at that time, Jobim had already passed away. I called Miucha by phone, And I asked her, who are the musicians on this track, the famous track? And she said, it's not Jobim on piano, it's Elvius Vilela. So the information that Jobim recorded Correnteza with Miucha on the Sérgio Cabral book, it's completely out of mind. It doesn't make sense at all, you know. They only recorded together in 75 the Urubu album, the track Oboto, and then in 77 when they did the first album for RCA. And then for many years I was curious about the fact that these albums had never been re-released on CD format, you know. And then I had the chance in 2001 to produce many things for RCA. I had two people there at RCA that were fantastic, Adriana Ramos and Hugo Nunes. They were like the A&R department for strategic products. And they allowed me to do many impossible reissues, albums by Flora Purim, Tamba Trio, Raul de Souza, that nobody would have ever approved, you know, unless you are really interested and concerned in music. And then for the first time, I told them we need to reissue in the entirety these two albums by Miucha and Jobim because they are precious and they were never released. There are only compilations. There were the one that you mentioned in France, the one in USA, and there was one in Brazil with a terrible cover art, you know, a terrible design, and missing many tracks. You know, it was incredible because the albums are not so big, so it could be possible to use both albums in one CD if they wanted to, you know, because it would be like 72 minutes of music. And but they never did. They only did these three compilations and without credits, without mentioning the musicians, without using the original cover art, without using the lyrics and the original liner notes. And I did it as it should have been done. You know, I did correctly both albums separately with the original cover and with all the credits and original liner notes, plus my uh, a few words, you know, to complement the original information. So they came out for the first time ever in 2001 as official releases.
Right, because the one that you release by BMG-RCA in Brazil is completely different from the one I have here that I bought in America.
Yeah, I think that it is in this one that you are holding. If you see the back cover, I mentioned at least on the back cover I mentioned the musicians. You know, I was able to add
Oh,
this
right.
this
Yes.
yeah. I mentioned Ron Carter, Oscar
Mhm.
Castro Neves, Rubens Bassini, and João Donato, and in the insert. And it was interesting because the sales department of the company at the time and the sales departments were very strong departments. They could say, "Oh, no, nobody will re-release this album because it will not sell. Just this, you know." And of course, they wanted just very popular releases people that would sell 1 million copies in 1 month, you know. And then they said, no, we will print just 1,000 copies of each album. I said, okay, no problem. Let's do it anyway. And in 1 week, it was completely sold out, the first album, the 77 album, because it was part of my contract with RCA and all the companies that I signed. When I signed a contract to produce a reissue, one of the things was that they had to send me a box with 25 copies of the album, promotional copies. And it was not because I wanted to deliver it to press, because the label was already going to send to the journalists and reviewers and everything, but because I wanted to have 25 copies to give to important people that could make the album happen, you know, the influencers. It was not the digital influencers like today, but it was like similar, you know, people that are not exactly on the press or not on the radio, but they are very influential. Then one of these people included, of course, people that use it to write and direct soap operas. So I sent this album to some of them, including Manuel Carlos, that was the famous director. And then he used the song, the one of the songs as the main theme of a soap opera in Brazil that was very, very popular. And in the original album in 77, the song Vai Levando was already used in a soap opera called Espelho Mágico, starred by great Brazilian artists like Glória Menezes, Tarcísio Meira, Juca de Oliveira, and the opening theme was Vai Levando. So in 77, the album became very successful because the first song was included in a soap opera soundtrack. And in 2001, when I released the CD, once again it happened because the song Pela Luz dos Olhos Teus was included on a famous soap opera. So the CD sold a lot and very quickly, very fast, and they had to reprint. And they asked me to produce also reissues for Japan. I did the reissue for France. There was a beautiful reissue in Europe with the help of Remy Copacopul, that was a famous journalist that loved Brazilian music in France. And they used everything I wrote again, liner notes, and they translated it to French. And the albums became very well released in the 2000s.
Right, because the one that you release by BMG RCA in Brazil is completely different from the one I have here that I bought in America.
Yeah, I think that it is in this one that you are holding. If you see the back cover, I mentioned at least on the back cover I mentioned the musicians. I was able to add
Oh,
this.
right. Yes.
Yeah, I mentioned Ron Carter, Oscar
Mhm.
Castro Neves, Rubens Bassini, and João Donato, and in the insert. And it was interesting because the sales department of the company at the time and the sales department were very strong departments. They could say, "Oh, no, nobody will re-release this album because it will not sell. Just this." And of course, they wanted just very popular releases, people that would sell 1 million copies in 1 month. And then they said, no, we will print just 1,000 copies of each album. I said, okay, no problem. Let's do it anyway. And in 1 week, it was completely sold out, the first album, the 77 album, because it was part of my contract with RCA and all the companies that I signed. When I signed a contract to produce a reissue, one of the things was that they had to send me a box with 25 copies of the album, promotional copies. And it was not because I wanted to deliver it to press, because the label was already going to send to the journalists and reviewers and everything, but because I wanted to have 25 copies to give to important people that could make the album happen, in the influencers. It was not the digital influencers like today, but it was like similar, people that are not exactly on the press or not on the radio, but they are very influential. Then one of these people included, of course, people that use it to write and direct soap operas. So I sent this album to some of them, including Manuel Carlos, that was the famous director. And then he used the song, the one of the songs as the main theme of a soap opera in Brazil that was very, very popular. And in the original album in 77, the song Vai Levando was already used in a soap opera called Espelho Mágico, starred by great Brazilian artists like Glória Menezes, Tarcísio Meira, Juca de Oliveira, and the opening theme was Vai Levando. So in 77, the album became very successful because the first song was included in a soap opera soundtrack. And in 2001, when I released the CD, once again it happened because the song Pela Luz dos Olhos Teus was included on a famous soap opera. So the CD sold a lot and very quickly, very fast, and they had to reprint. And they asked me to produce also reissues for Japan. I did the reissue for France. There was a beautiful reissue in Europe with the help of Remy Copacopul, that was a famous journalist that loved Brazilian music in France. And they used everything I wrote again, liner notes, and they translated it to French. And the albums became very well released in the 2000s.
Talking about selling albums, when I interviewed Creed Taylor, he said the same thing about jazz samba. He took it to the market department of Verve, and they said, "Forget about this title, jazz samba. Just don't sell." So they want
Yeah.
to take the name out that he created of a jazz samba.
And then the album, they were always wrong, these people. I don't know what they needed to drink, because they were always drunk. They are famous because they never were right about something, They use it to, oh, it's not sell. Like this Jazz Samba album. The album went to number one in the pop charts with Desafinado, went to number one. It was the most sold a single of the entire year, United States, and won a Grammy and everything. They never, never were right. First album that was released in '77, and it was originally supposed to be just. And then Jobim went to the first sessions. He was, of course, her first guest. And then he recorded the song, and he said, "Oh, just one song. Let me play more." And then he returned the next day to record two more. And then, of course, Aloysio de Oliveira, who was producing the album. Aloysio was the most important, I think, one of the most important producers of all time in Brazil, especially during the Bossa Nova years. He was the one that signed João Gilberto to Odeon label. Was a close friend of Jobim, very close friend. Like I say, like Vinícius de Moraes, in the same level, that they have of intimacy. And then he pursued RCA to do an album of the both together, not just a Miucha album with special guest Jobim, because he wanted to play on the full album. He said, "Of course I play it, no problem." And he decided to do the arrangements and everything. And it's also very interesting because it was the first time since the mid '60s that Jobim once again did arrangements for album, because after he did the first album United States with Klaus Ogerman in '63, he was so impressed by Klaus Ogerman writing that he decided to retire as an arranger. He never more recorded any album. He only started to record again as an arranger on this album in '77. He recorded all the other albums with Nelson Riddle, with Klaus Ogerman, and then Elmir Deodato. And then for Miucha, he once again did the arrangement. They don't use a symphony orchestra. They did it for a small ensemble and flute. No? Jobim loved flute. He used it to play flute himself. Son Paulo also is on the album playing flute, and Paulo Jobim, who was Antonio Carlos Jobim's son, they did with bass, drums. The team of musicians on this first album, '77, is incredible. It includes three great drummers, Robertinho Silva, Wilson das Neves, and Rubinho Moreira. Percussion Ariovaldo Contesini, on basses Novelli, Luiz Alves, and Edson Lobo. And on flutes, Paulo Jobim, Franklin, and Danilo Caymmi. Dori Caymmi on acoustic guitar in some tracks, and Peter Dalsberg on cello. It was the first time that Jobim used the cello separate from a string section. No? And the repertoire is incredible because for the first time in many, many years, Jobim didn't want to record only his songs. He recorded two other songs of other people. From Ari Barroso, for example, he chose Na Batucada da Vida, that was one of his favorite songs. He had planned to record it with Elis Regina on their album, but there, in the movie you can see they rehearsing the song, but they didn't record in the final sessions. And he did it here with Miucha, and sounds very beautiful song. There's also more contemporary songs by Nelson Angelo, for example, like Tiro Cruzado, Nelson Angelo and Márcio Borges. And of course, they decided to invite Chico Buarque de Holanda as a special guest. That was very important for help the promotion of the album. And Chico, that is Miucha's brother, sings on three tracks: Vai Levando, Sei Lá, and Maninha, that is a song that Chico wrote for his sister, for Miucha. And there's a nice rendition of Samba do Avião also, Pela Luz dos Olhos Teus, that is the song that was a hit when the CD was re-released because it was included in the soap opera. And I love the song Choro de Nada, that is a song by Eduardo Souto Neto and Geraldine Carneiro. Very beautiful song. And the last track is interesting because it's a song that Jobim loved so much that he recorded not so much. In very special occasions only. He once told me this. It was a song that he recorded only with Gal Costa. He also did with Astrud Gilberto on Astrud's first album, the Astrud Gilberto album. And I remember that one of the times that he went to my house to visit Carlos Barbosa Lima, that was my guest. Carlos, great guitar player who lived in New York. Every year for more than 10 years, he used to spend his holidays in Rio, in my house. But actually, he spent most of the time rehearsing. And so a lot of people used to go there to visit him, like Luis Bonfá and Jobim and Paulo Jobim, and they were all the time doing arrangements and everything. And then I remember that I had got a CD by Bill Evans and Monica Zetterlund. Monica Zetterlund is Swedish, a great singer from Sweden, and they had recorded this song. It was the only Jobim song that Bill Evans recorded. When I was doing a session for Itamar Corex last, that became Jobim last session, we recorded this song. It was incredible because he had heard the song in my house, his song, of course. He was the composer, but he was like, oh, I had almost forgotten about this song because I don't play in the concerts, I don't play with my band, I don't play it for many years. When we went to studio to record, it was the first song that he decided. He did three songs with Itamara, and one of the songs was this one, É Preciso Dizer Adeus, that in English the title is All That's Left Is to Say Goodbye. And when he did the session with us in September '94, it unfortunately became Jobim's last recording session. And he did a very beautiful session here with Miucha too. But I prefer the one that I produced. It's even better, because there's an interlude and there's was more free, at home. And I remember that Jobim also told me when I talked about this album with him that he was worried, about this. I say it on the liner notes that at the time there was a lot of criticism about him in Brazil, saying that he was Americanized, all this stuff, that he was actually a jazz man, a frustrated jazz man, that bossa nova was a kind of American jazz. And so I think that he took the opportunity with these albums with Miucha, he took the opportunity to say, okay, forget about Fender Rhodes. I'll not play Fender Rhodes. I'll go back to my acoustic piano. Forget about songs in English. I'll play Brazilian songs by other composers. I think that there was a logical, he had a strategy that he wanted to follow that was like to be more acceptable in Brazil once again and to regain Brazilian audience. That was a completely we have a new Jobim after 77. That the contract with Warner Brothers was over. Of course, he tried once again in 79 with the Terra Brasilis album, but it failed. It was not a commercial success. So I think that after this album, he tried to concentrate more in Brazil, in local performances and everything. And after the album release, of course, there was no way to escape from live performances. That when Aloysio de Oliveira talked with Mário Prioli, that was the owner of Canecão, that was this big, huge nightclub, and then they did the concerts there for 7 months, and a lot of great guys on the band. And then on the album that you probably will also play, there's an orchestra. They had an orchestra conducted by Edson Frederico with strings and trumpets and trombones and flutes and lots of female vocalists, including Ana Jobim in the end of the engagement. It was a very successful album. So after the engagement at Canecão, had been also very successful. They had the opportunity to record a second album. It began like an independent production that was done by Aloysio de Oliveira once again, of course, and he recorded in New York most of the tracks. Even Chico Buarque participation on the album was recorded in New York. And once again, we recorded with Ron Carter, his longtime friend. It's interesting because on the movie Elise Tom, someone interviews Ron Carter. And then he says, "Oh, I recorded 2 albums with Jobim, Wave and Stoneflower." Someone had to talk with him that Ron forgot that he recorded 8 albums with Jobim. He recorded Machita Perê, he recorded Wave, Tide, Stoneflower, Machita Perê, Urubu, the second album with Miucha, a live album in Rio, and Jobim's final album that was Antônio Brasileiro. Ron Carter recorded a great version of How Insensitive with Sting singing. Anyway, Ron Carter is on the session playing acoustic bass and electric bass. On that track that we love, Dinheiro em Penca, Ron Carter is playing electric bass. It's a very nice sound, very nice phrasing. And Oscar Castro Neves playing acoustic guitar and also doing the arrangements. There are orchestras, woodwinds, and strings, not brass, no trumpets, no trombones, just woodwinds and strings. And a great Brazilian player, percussion player, that few people talk about him, that is Rubens Bassini. Rubens was incredible guy. He passed away more than 30 years ago. And Rubens went to USA to play. He played in Brazil with a guy called Valdir Calmon. Valdir Calmon was a fantastic piano player, very famous in the 50s. Rubens Bassini was his percussion player, playing mostly bongos. Then Bassini went to USA to play with Sérgio Mendes and Brazil 66. When Dom Romão was on drums, the percussion was Rubens Bassini. When he left Sérgio Mendes, he became Diodato percussion player from 73 to 79. And then he became the favorite percussion for first choice percussion player for Dave Grusin. And he played with Dave Grusin for 5 years until he passed away. And Rubens Bassini is on his top form on the second Miucha and Jobim album. And one interesting point is that also, once again, there are many old songs for people written by people like Marino Pinto. Marino Pinto was one of João Gilberto's favorite composers as well. Also, Samba do Carioca by Carlos Lira. There's a beautiful tune by Bororó. Bororó is incredible. Sublime Tortura. It's a lovely song. And a song by Jobim with Marino Pinto that I I don't know who else recorded it. That is Aula de Matemática. There's even a song by Miucha herself that she wrote the melody and the lyrics called Triste Alegria. And the Nó Cego by Toquinho and Cacaso. And the last track that lasts for 10 minutes, that is Jobim and Cacaso Dinheiro em Penca with Chico Buarque guesting on vocals. And then after they had recorded everything, they decided to do an additional track that was done in Rio, and this song became the most played on radio, that received a lot of airplay at the time. That was Na Turma do Funil. That was a very old song also. That was by Mirabeau, Milton de Oliveira e Urgel de Castro. That was adapted by Jobim. He added an extra part. And this song was arranged by João Donato. And Donato plays piano on this song along with Jobim, but on this track it's mostly Donato. And Jamil Joanes from Banda Black Rio on bass, Hélio Capucci no violão, Adilson Werneck on drums, Hélio Capucci on acoustic guitar, and many percussionists that are listed and many people on the choir. There's a lot of backing vocalists, everybody's there. Olivia Jaime, Novelli, Nelson Ângelo, Bebel Gilberto is there, Thelma Costa is there. It's funny. It was like, I imagine, I guess, the kind of party that they had in the studios, the big fun they had, drinking a lot, because the lyrics are incredible. It's talking about this group of people that drinks a lot and everything, and smoke and everything. It's very funny lyric, and gives there's a very nice mood on this track, very happy mood, and João Donato was perfect on the arrangement. It was in the 79 session.